Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 12 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, most importantly, an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia, and most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically behind how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long term for the long game towards a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and dig a little deeper. But this is a special edition of Beyond Top 10 Tennis. We've had a couple previously and the Australian Open is still on, so we're going to keep with it, and today's episode marks our 70th one to date. So look, today's topic, we're diving into the round of 16, so it plays its own role like so many other episodes in this special edition and those prior in developing the player, parent to coach for that road ahead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you've been with us for some time now, thank you so much. You are familiar with these special editions. If you haven't been listening to us previously and this is your first, I would encourage you to listen to a handful of our other special editions, but also the ones leading up to the Australian Open to, I guess, better ascertain where we're coming from, those 65-ish plus episodes to date prior, because today's episode marks number 70, would you believe it or not? So, oh my goodness. And I think to put that in perspective, Beyond Top 10 Tennis has been around, I think, almost for 8 months now, roughly. And throughout that time, it was only just before Christmas that my 12th book was released, How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking, which I think really goes on to show how jam-packed / chaotic 2023 was. And we're already in more than 3 weeks in to 2024, and we keep going. And so it has been a crazy whirlwind 8 months. But look, those of you who know me, I just could not resist to just share these special editions of Beyond Top Tennis with or in conjunction with the Australian Open, because it really presented, I think, something unique and opportune time to share these additional insights. Those of you who are familiar with my work, normally this time of year is when I'm really digging deeper and just starting to write essentially the next book. So I'm collecting data, specific insights of the Australian Open and the Grand Slams to come of the year. and it's very, I think, in depth. But I made the decision that this year, you know what, Beyond Top 10 Tennis is here. So why not take a different approach and share some direct insights with you right here, right now, as live as can be. And again, those of you who have been following along for some time know that typically I would record a number of episodes in advance, and we're talking a few weeks prior. But these are on the fly, as in they need to be recorded, if not the day up to, I think, the release, to make sure I'm being able to share the matches up until now, which has been quite challenging, but also I've been having a lot of fun. So I hope you've been having fun with me. But before we dive into, we're up to days 8, 9, and 10. So the round of 16 onwards. And look, today, I believe, is the end of the quarterfinals, which is, oh my goodness. But wow. So we've got all of the round of 16 matches to get through, and the beginning of the other half of the quarterfinals, and so we'll get a nice wrap prior to the end of today's episode. But before that, maybe you have been familiar with or been following along. There have been a number of I'll call them blog posts, but I think they're so much more than that because they're so heavy and rich in detail that I've been sharing over the past, I guess now 10 days in conjunction with the Australian Open. But I think more recently, we've got from day 7 insights on Zheng versus Wang, and I've made the decision I'm not going to edit this piece at this point, but I want to make a correction before we kick things off, because I did share in our previous episode and in this piece that this was Zheng's most peak performance, which is actually incorrect. It is equal to her peak performance. Recall the US Open was also that quarter-final result. So this Australian Open, we will see if she can make that next jump. But also that piece dived into really interesting insights on Wang and if that can be maintained. And then over the last 2 days specifically, it's insights on Sinner over Kakanakov with new data analytics and how to dethrone Djokovic. I really dived in deeper there, and instead of just pinpointing, I think, the analytical differences between those two players, I wanted to share even more. And so I carried that over with the insights on Hurkacz and Kazuk's new tennis data, how to overcome Djokovic again, and what it really takes to win a Grand Slam. And this is really interesting because, of course, I dug a little bit deeper because I wanted to share those additional insights. And then the piece coming out today at the same time as today's episode will be insights on Fritz against Djokovic, how to join the top 10, what it takes to beat Djokovic, and more. And so I made, I guess, the decision when writing those pieces that why not push the marker further? Because I talk about how these players need to just push themselves a little bit further. And our metrics obviously directly correlate with why Djokovic is so successful, not only at the Australian Open, but the key differential there. You would have heard me talk about that. Fritz did have the capacity to overcome Djokovic, but it was only if certain metrics were evident in his game and they were able to be sustained, so maintained. And we know the results, so that wasn't the case. So before, I think, diving into that, let's start with the WTA, so the women's tour. And we've got the fourth round. And I mean, look, the third round finished with, I think, the number one seed, the number one player in the world, Swiatek, falling to Noskova. And so we begin with Noskova coming out with the win against Svitolina. However, there's not too much, I think, to share on this, simply because Svitolina retired after essentially a break. So Noskova won that 3-love, retired. And I'm really feeling for Svitolina, because she really had that chance, I think, to get on over to the quarterfinals, and I really think she would have been able to make the semi-finals. It would have been a bit of a struggle, but she definitely was favoured in that respect, if not to make the finals. I think this was one of her best runs to date, even before she stepped away from tour to start a family. So this was really disheartening, because she had all of those metrics that were in her favour. Things were tracking very well. And I guess if Svitolina, you're listening, I'm so sorry, because this probably isn't what you want to hear. But these metrics were very positive in her favour. So all credit to Noskova. That is going to be very interesting, I think, to how that plays out against Jastrzębska today. Granted, Jastrzębska is a qualifier. She does have a number of matches under her belt. Noskova definitely is more fresher, given essentially almost a walkover. So that's going to be a player with fresher legs by a long shot over a player who is not as fresh. But given that they're both relatively young / newer on tour, in contrast to some more senior players, which is very ironic saying senior when it's really players in their later 20s. It's I think that's very silly in that respect. But the recovery is going to be exceptional, irrespective of both players. I think it's well understood for players, whether they're teenagers, early 20s, you're going to bounce back, in contrast to someone who is later on, late 20s, even early 30s. The recovery begins to slow a bit, so you need to be very tactful and careful in that respect. Okay, so we know that Jastrzębska got through to the quarters, but oh my goodness, she had to take down Azarenka. And Azarenka, she did not play bad. I'm going to say, was the consistency there? The key metrics, they were there, however, they were fluctuating. The level or rate of application we talk about or touch on, it was not there, so it was not the same. She still played a relatively very high level, potentially in alignment with that 18th seeding. But Jastrzębska, she really held her game together tight, and was able to pack a punch, and that's what I think was the most impressive. That that consistency was there, the level of maintenance was there. Am I seeing the metrics how I would like to see them? No, but are those metrics good enough, consistent enough to cause enough problems for her opponent, who happened to be Azarenka in this case, to get that win? Yes. Is she able to force the opponent to make the error? Yes. And that's where it really came from. Jastrzębska, I'm not going to say was hitting Azarenka off the court. It was more so her game was able to be that much more consistent. She was able to maintain her level of play to force the error from Azarenka wanting to go more. Was Azarenka playing at her peak performance level? No. I'm going to say she was making one too many errors, so she wasn't able to hone in her game as much as typically we would see her. But let's say all credit to Jastrzębska then in this respect for, I guess, putting the pressure on and making Azarenka feel pressure in this respect. The next match is I thought was going to be closer, and that's obviously Paolini versus Kalinskaya. Paolini is obviously the higher ranked player. I think Kalinskaya, she's peaked around 50, which is obviously drastically going to change with that win. I had seen Paolini play a lot more solid, more consistent, pack a few more punches out there in her previous rounds. But Kalinskaya, I have to say, she has a very positive metrics, and it's so subtle, her wins, in a very good way. So you could really see against her third round encounter against Stevens how frustrating that would have been. But also now against Paolini, because it's incredibly clever. She frustrates her opponents to the point where they need to go for more. And Kalinskaya is very cool and calm under pressure and waits for her opponent to want to go for more and draws out the error. Now, we all know these are very good metrics and good indicators of what we want for a player to ascend towards a top 20 ranking. Is there a powerhouse, a weapon that really knocks her opponent off the court? No, not that I'm seeing, not yet. That's a part of her game to be developed. So her quarterfinal encounter against Zheng is going to be very interesting. Zheng does have that weapon. She's very solid off the ground, and I think that's going to be Kalinskaya's first real encounter for that, if Zheng is able to be consistent and hold her game together. And given that she has made the quarterfinals, Zheng, I'm pretty sure, is primed to become a barrier breaker, and I'm sure next week when the new rankings come out, most likely will be in the top 10. So that is incredibly exciting that we've got our first barrier breaker for the season. Those of you who are unfamiliar with that language, it is that player that progresses inside the top 10, which is typically limited to 2% of players each and every season. So it's incredibly minute, and this is a very positive marker. Kalinskaya, depending on her performance and what's to come in the next couple of days, this player is definitely on the radar, irrespective of that third round outcome against Stevens. That was incredibly tough. But there are metrics in this player's game which are quite positive. That is definitely a player to keep an eye on. Granted that weapon is developed, we are going to be seeing a lot more of Kalinskaya. All right, which brings us to Zheng and Dodin. This was, I think, very lopsided. And I think, in all fairness, Zheng, actually, this is the best I had seen her play. Potentially because her encounter, for example, against Wang, Wang was just playing really solid. And look, that's the one that was 10-8 in the third set tiebreak. So that could have gone either way. She'd really played a very high quality opponent. However, when it came to Zheng against Dodin, did not play her game. She was not able to. Zheng did not give her an opportunity. There were very limited occasions where Dodin really was able to step up. Zheng was incredibly dominant, and I think this is the first match I've seen Zheng play all Australian Open that aligned with her seed. So obviously she's the 12th seed, and that was able to come through. I think is very lucky in a respect in a couple of matches that Zheng's been able to make it this far. But all credit to her is that, look, round of 16, she put on a show. She was able to lift her level, and I think that's what I was most excited and interested about, to go, there we are. That's where it has been. This explains why Zheng is seated 12th and why she is now, I'm going to say, has made it to become a barrier breaker, which is very interesting to see what's to come. But I'm waiting to see the next level. I'm going to say, obviously, Zhang is favourite against Kalinskaya in the quarterfinals to make her first semi-final appearance. But given Kalinskaya's recent performances, how she's flown under the radar, and given her ranking, she is definitely the underdog. But also given her performance, whether it has been most recently against Paolini to Stevens, and we know Stevens has won a Grand Slam in the past, this is actually going to be quite interesting on two fronts. For Zhang, if she's able to play as that number 12 player or seed, and then for Kalinskaya, if she's able to continue frustrating her opponents and make a further breakthrough, and I want to see if against this caliber of player, if her game is the same or it's compromised, so it regresses. And it's going to be a very interesting dynamic then for Zhang as well, against this type of player with this type of game. So I'm hopeful this gives you a few insights that either way, it's not going to be shocking. It's going to tell us so much more about that player's capacity. Zhang, if she's able to progress, even though she's going to be up against this type of player that doesn't necessarily have those weapons, but is that tight and consistent. Kalinskaya against Zhang, we're going to see if she's able to lift her game up another level, which I really think she has the capacity to do so, because in that second set against Stevens, we were able to see some really positive insights there. Zhang, I think we've seen the ups and downs, but she's going to hang in there. She's not going to go away. But we want to see if she can lift her game. I think against Wang, she wasn't able to always lift her game because of, again, the quality of opponent and that level of play. Doden, she did not give Doden a chance, Zhang. She just whipped through that. So let's see if it's one or the other, or it falls somewhere in between. That's going to be quite interesting. All right, now we've got Kostyuk against Timofeeva. This was quite interesting. We know Timofeeva was also a qualifier, which is very exciting given it is the round of 16 at a Grand Slam. Two qualifiers that have been obviously in the round of 16. Jasper Menska obviously progressed to the quarterfinals. Timofeeva did fall to Kostyuk. Now, this was tight because Kostyuk is an absolutely... she's here. She has arrived. That ranking is going to go even further. She's been able to pack a punch. Very positive metrics. I've been very impressed by her. Probably one of 2-3 players this whole Australian Open that's really been able to just come out of the shadows to show their game. And it's not necessarily just by being consistent and forcing the error from their opponents. We're talking about weapons that are there as well that really threaten to dethrone their opponents. And Kostyuk, she brings it. Against Timofeeva, it was very straightforward, 2-1, especially in contrast to her prior 3-set against Evanesyan. Sorry for that pronunciation, but that was a deep 3-set match. And I say that because quarterfinals, Kostyuk, she fell to Gauff, but in 3. I mean, 7-6, 6-7, 6-2. And we know, I think that third set, it was very clear that Kostyuk simply just ran out of gas ever so slightly, and Gauff just ran it home, took the advantage. Was Gauff playing exceptional? Absolutely not. That was not her, I think, perfect game. but she showed what she was made of, which is really impressive. But credit then to Kostyuk just not allowing Gauff to play her game. So it's another example, I think, very similar with Kalinskaya and Kostyuk, two players I think to keep a close eye on. Both are going to definitely ascend inside the top 30. Let's see how close they get towards the top 20. Obviously, with Kostyuk falling in the quarters, we're not too sure, but if Kalinskaya progresses past the quarters, that's going to be a different story. Both of them, I think Kostyuk is the higher ranked player, so I'm going to guess closer to the top 20 range, because Kostyuk has been, I think, as high as inside the top 40, closer to the top 30. Kalinskaya, I think, is closer to 100-ish at the moment, but has been as high as inside the top 60, so closer to top 50 from memory. So that will, I think, nudge a lot closer to the top 30. But again, these are approximations because I don't have the rankings in front of me, and I think it's really important to be transparent in that respect. So these are depending on their performances and how far they progress, but we're really looking at the markers here because the season ahead, and if these are one-off performances or not. Kostyuk, this is definitely not a one-off performance given her current ranking, how she's been progressing, and her metrics. This is a very healthy sign, so it's one to watch out for the rest of the season. Kalinskaya, given that she had regressed from a peak ranking high, this is going to be interesting to see if this is another peak and it's going to follow with a regression, or this is a peak that's going to be sustained, so maintained throughout the season. So we want to see if this result and or similar is followed throughout the season and correlates with those that new ranking high. All right, this brings us to Gauff's fourth round encounter then, so the round of 16 against Fretch, and this was not surprising but by any means. 6-1, 6-2, nice and clean, because again, Gauff against Parks in the third round was 0-2, really clean, and that's why I'm sharing that. Kostyuk, I think, pushed Gauff the most she'd been pushed this tournament, if not the last few rounds, because it was so tight. I think it was quite surprising that Kostyuk got after the first set. I want to say she was up 4-5-1 before Gauff came back to win that tiebreak, which again was very close, 8-6. So Gauff, I think, was the one that was able to just toe the line there and make it count when it really mattered. But it just goes to show how tight that match was. It would be very interesting to see the other or the remaining quarterfinals be equally as tight. There's definitely potential for a couple, the last two of them, to be as tight, which is very promising to see for, I guess, future progressions for the rest of the season. So time will tell. Now, again, this fourth round, Krejcikova Andreeva. This was quite solid. I think we were all surprised in a way that Andreeva got that first set 6-4, and all credit to her, 16 years of age. We've all heard about her now, that she won the championship last year, and look, round of 16 this year. This is very good. But a very side note here is that I was very happy for Andreeva, because what this shows us, it's a level that we can build upon, because it's, if, for example, Andreeva progressed to the quarters, semis, even finals, this would have definitely been followed by a very steep regression, and that's what the data tells us. So it was very good in that respect that Andreeva did make the round of 16, of course, but Krejcikova went through, because now this is a very healthy metric, because we want long-term metric for a player to sustained their level of play. And I can't stress that enough. Players who peak too soon, the likelihood of them regressing just as quickly is incredibly high. I think Raducanu is a prime example of that. Unfortunately, there was a huge progression, but that level of all those heights of success were not able to be maintained. I think she had a couple of okay tournaments thereafter. Unfortunately, injuries, but since she's been coming back, she does have some of the key metrics, but not those that directly correlate with that top 10 ranking. So we want to give time. But just to close off on that, Raducanu, is that she definitely has that capacity, but we want the progression there. So Andreeva is a very good example for the progression. Golf, a couple of years ago, a similar thing happened. The progression. We want the round of 16s, but we want that steadiness there, opposed to that firecracker performance that ends up being a huge regression. So this is to allow a player to have a good level of maintenance, to form a very healthy baseline to build upon. So, but to Krejcikova, all credit to her, because she just stuck in there. And I think as far as her weapons were concerned, it really was her consistency that won the match at the end of the day. But when we're looking at the quarterfinals, did Krejcikova play her game, I think, that she's so highly accustomed to? Of course not. Sabalenka was next level. Sabalenka showed why she's the defending champion and the number 2 seed, which, looking at Sabalenka's win against Anisimova, that actually had a high likelihood of testing Sabalenka, potentially going to 3. And I think it's the match where Sabalenka has given up the most, if not equal to the most games, given her 3rd round match against Tsurenko, and that was 0-0. It was just an absolutely exceptional performance from Sabalenka. And now I think following that up against Anisimova 3-2, and then against Krejcikova 2-3, she's being absolutely brutal. I think it goes without saying, she is the absolute favourite now to defend her title. It's going to be very, very interesting, potentially to see what's to come in the semi-finals. That's going to be her biggest test. And I think, again, it goes without saying, irrespective who wins that semi-final encounter, Gauff to Sabalenka is definitely the favourite, because we've got the defending champion against the newly crowned US Open champion. And there are some really interesting metrics here, which I won't elaborate on depending on who wins against those two. But Sabalenka, that's absolutely exceptional. She's definitely primed to progress even further. And I think in contrast to 12 months ago and her ranking, and even during the year, the 2023, when she did get the number 1 ranking, I would say Swiatek was playing more solid. And why Swiatek obviously soon after held on to that number 1 ranking once again. But Sabalenka, after this Australian Open, she's definitely been playing more clean. And if we're contrasting the two, say Sabalenka and Swiatek's performance early on this season, granted Swiatek had very tricky first and second and third round encounters. Sabalenka is very deserving of that number 1 spot, especially after this Australian Open, which I am somewhat surprised to be sharing, but it's just that evident. Sabalenka's been packing a punch, holding her game together, and it's something, unfortunately, Swiatek was not able to do this Australian Open, irrespective of the opponents that she has had, but the performance, I think, against Krejcikova, who is a top 10 tennis player, and for it to be so clean, really signals some promising signs. But it also, I think, has to be said that Sabalenka has not been tested by a former Grand Slam champion and or finalist. She will, though, for the very first time in the semi-finals. On the other hand, Swiatek had that early on, so she was not able to find a rhythm. She was not afforded a chance to warm up in those earlier rounds. She really had to, I think, sprint off the starting line, and when that happens, you're more susceptible to fall. So it's very tricky to compare and or deliver those contrasting results given the quality of the opponents very early on. But I just want to underscore that Sabalenka's, I think, performance this Australian Open, following obviously her finalist result at the Brisbane International, has really been impressive. Rybakina, though, who obviously beat Sabalenka in the final, she again obviously had that hurdle where her opponent was just way too good on the day, and she just was not playing, I think, that level. So it's really interesting when we're looking at Sabalenka's quality of play, that next level that has been delivered, I think, this Australian Open, which does wrap up, I think, the women's draw when we're looking at the fourth round and what's to come in today's, I think, other half of the quarterfinals. But look, I think the quarterfinals that have been, with Gorth making it to the semi-finals, Sabalenka through to the semi-finals, is absolutely exceptional. And we are going to have, I think, two new semi-finalists on the other side, and then we are going to have how that the draws just panned out. Not only the new semi-finalist, but again, a very brand new finalist. And recall, I think, a number of episodes at the end of the 23. So they're probably going to be within the last, I'm going to say 10 episodes, probably the last 6, 7, where it's been touched on why the Australian Open is so popular for players to make their breakthrough. Why, more often than not, top 10 players do not always make the finals when they're favoured to do so. There's typically a breakthrough, and why we see a lot of new finalists. And there's been a number over the years, to even champions, there's been a number over the years that have had their one-offs even. And this is excluding those who obviously have won the Australian Open as a top 10 tennis player, or who have previously won Grand Slams. These are, we're talking about the singular instances or instances here. And this really underscores that it's going to happen again. We already have a guaranteed new finalist with guaranteed new semi-finalists, and we've got a number new quarterfinalists. So I love that, of course, that this was shared / with our predictive analytics that this would happen. And lo and behold, it's only been a few weeks and it's happening again. And this is goes to show how powerful the body of work is, how powerful our data is, because we can pinpoint that these occurrences happen and why. But I think for more of that, try to catch up on our blog posts, this Australian Open, that I have been under the pump writing. They've been very heavy pieces, but they really do share a lot more than I think what I'm giving away here, because it's a lot more detailed. But to really, I think, wrap up, I think, the women's side of the draw, it's just very important, I think, when looking for those additional insights and the key differentials in that respect. All right, this brings us now to the men's side, and we've had some fun matches here. Ones that I thought were going to go, let's say, a lot deeper, and others that really did go all the way, and then finished, I think, with a bit of a lull. And I think the first one to kick things off, and round of 16 is Djokovic-Mannarino, that was some really clean tennis. Djokovic, he looked a little bit under the weather in that match, but I don't think you can be any more brutal. In a Grand Slam / best of 5, 0-3. Mannarino, he started to find a little bit of form, I think, in the third, but equally, I think that Djokovic was getting a little bit frustrated and just had a slight lapse. But I think that was an exceptionally clean match. The best I've seen Djokovic play all tournament. And I mean, you can't argue with that scoreline in that respect. And I think it really showed that he was able to just move his game up a level. So I don't think Mannarino necessarily played a horrible or bad game whatsoever. It was on the day where Djokovic was playing that much more solid. And we have to remember that Mannarino is the 20th seed. So it's not like Djokovic was playing a qualifier at all. It's we know Mannarino is a very seasoned and skilled player, especially with his 5-set win over Shelton. That was an absolutely exceptional performance. And so to come out against Djokovic and to have that scoreline is a little bit bittersweet, I would say, by making the round of 16. I think that's his best Grand Slam performance. If not, it's definitely in recent years. So again, I think it highlights how well he was playing. And then we know from yesterday's quarterfinal against Fritz that this was a really big one. And when I say it was a really big one, it's that Fritz had the capacity. So recall, I think, at the very beginning of the Australian Open that Fritz was really pushed and his metrics were not looking good, and that I wouldn't have been surprised if he fell early on. And then he started to pick his game up, despite the 4-setters, etc. that he's had. But when he came up against Tsitsipas, that was next level, and that's what we want to talk about. The Fritz and Tsitsipas. Did Tsitsipas play his best? No, I think he held back. He wasn't really able to flow through. But also that's how Tsitsipas has been playing. He wasn't looking like he was in form to make the finals once again. Fritz, on the other hand, he started to tighten his game. These are the little metrics that we look for as a player progresses, or if they don't, as obviously the tournament goes on and they progress deeper in the draw. Fritz, though, he really did start to actually look like the 12th seed, with signs of why he was ranked inside the top 10. And it was even though the scoreline looks relatively tight, Fritz made it count when it mattered. And that's what made me go, if Fritz actually progresses even more and brings his level up slightly more against Djokovic, he has a chance. That first set, he started to hone that game in. He tightened his game and he was playing very solid despite going down in that tiebreaker. He got that second set. That was very good. That's what we were looking for. However, he lost. He lost track of that level of maintenance. There was a slight glitch. And when you're up against Djokovic, those glitches are a null. Fritz started, and I shared this in our most recent blog post, is that he started to pull back, for example, on his backhands. He was not leveraging his kinetic chain. He was not using his momentum to his advantage. Now, to give some more insights here, of course, Djokovic was. He was leveraging his kinetic chain. He was falling through his shots, leveraging that momentum. And if you're up against a player who's doing that and you are not doing that in return, they're going to push you back and back up over the baseline, and you're going to be hitting, whether it's your forehand or your backhand, almost like you're falling backwards at times, which was the case for Fritz. So that's how he was losing ground. That's how Djokovic gets his opponents to lose ground, because if your technical side proponents are not tight-knit, that they cannot compound the oncoming effects of his ball, this is what happens. And that is why I've shared it again in recent blog posts. Of course, Djokovic can be defeated. We've seen it. We've seen Sinner do the case, which that's another discussion shortly. But no, if you're not going to do the same, if you cannot hold your own, this is what's going to happen. And what is most exciting against Sinner is that he can hold his own, and we've seen that before. Round of 16, Sinner against Kakanakov. We thought that was going to be a little tighter, but you know what? Sinner made it count. That definitely had the prospects to go to 4, potentially 5, but how clean did Sinner play? 4, 5, and 3. I was very impressed. And you know what? Sinner looked like he finished and he could have gone another 2 sets, and that's what we want. We need to remember that Sinner really is on the same level, the same stage as Alcaraz. Alcaraz, however, has had, let's say, the better draws, if you like. He was able to peak sooner, but this is Sinner's time by all accounts. We've been tracking Sinner, and you've got me in my publications, in our books, and now on Beyond Top 10 Tennis, underscoring and outlining, marking Sinner, but this is his season. And last season was his peak. It was his arrival of, I'm ready to claim my maiden Grand Slam. It's really a case now of that level of maintenance. Or so, again, against Rublev in that quarterfinal, definitely had those prospects of going a lot longer, being a lot more trickier, given Rublev was pushed to 5 sets by de Minaur, and de Minaur was primed to make that quarterfinal appearance. But let's remember, de Minaur cracked the top 10. He was primed to become a barrier breaker. So that's another barrier breaker, but this time on the men's side. Rublev, though, we also need to remember he's the 5th seed. And when you've got the 5th seed going up against the 10th seed, that's where those micro percentages matter. And that's what came through. Look, Rublev was 6-4, 6-7, 6-7. 6-3, 6-0, and it was a brutal match. And I think it's only fair to say in that 5th set there was a slight lapse, and de Minaur, so Alex, his tank was just not as full. Rublev somehow, some way had it left in the tank, and de Minaur, he was suffering in some way, shape or form for that scoreline, because it was so much more closer than that 6-0 suggests, so it's a little bit painful, I think, for Alex, but all credit to Rublev. He just stuck to the plan, played his game, and that's all it takes. When you're playing a player of that caliber, it's just that slight glitch. And that is why Rublev presented a very big challenge potentially for Sinner. And it was 7-6 and 3. It was tight, but it goes to show Sinner knuckled down when it counted. Very similar, or almost the same scoreline against Kakanakov. And Sinner was able to hone in and focus. And you know who else is able to do that? Is Djokovic. And we know Sinner's success against Djokovic last season. This is a different hunting ground, because we know the level of success Djokovic has had at the Australian Open really places him like he's playing at home. So it's going to be very interesting, irrespective that Sinner's got Darren Cahill in his coach's corner. Those of you who are unfamiliar, that he's an Australian coach. So it's going to be very interesting, I think, from this perspective. Of course, Sinner has the tools, of course. It's going to come down to that level of maintenance. They're looking at those key metrics. Now, both of these are primed, but Sinner, I'm going to say, has the advantage in respect to be able to hold his game together to progress to the finals. However, if there is a glitch, Djokovic is going to pounce on that. And that is how close these two are when we're looking at those key metrics. All right, so the other half of the draw, and they're playing their quarterfinals today, but round of 16, Hercax against Kazooks. Now there's a blog post on this. Kazooks came in as that wild card. He is on the radar. Those metrics were so impressive. If he continues those metrics this season, top 50, here we come, potentially top 30. Hercax, though, I think this is the cleanest game I saw him play. I had concerns prior, but this was good. I'm really looking forward to today's match against Hercax and Medvedev. But I tell you what, which brings me to Medvedev. He has been under the radar too. Berge pushed Medvedev to 4, but you know what? The second set was a tie break. So we've got 7-3, 7-6, 5-7, 6-1. So it was actually very close. All credit to Berge. He played a lot better than it was projected. So in a very good way. But Medvedev, that final set 6-1 was very brutal. But again, I think just an empty tank for a player who had not progressed, I think, this far before. But in equal amounts exciting, definitely on the radar. Let's see if Berge can continue, I think, that performance throughout the season. But he's definitely flagged to potentially ascend inside the top 30. If not in the initial quarter of this season, towards the later. But we really want to see that level of maintenance throughout the season. But let's talk more about Hercax and Medvedev. Look, the ranking, I think, says it all, or the seeding is 3 and 9. So Medvedev is going in as the favourite. But I think it really can't be underrated. If recall Hercax against Federer a number of years ago at Wimbledon. He really can come out of the shadows. That was his breakthrough. He does have the tools. He does have the weapons. Is Hercax playing his best? Has he reached his peak? No. And that's where it's at. If this match he begins to peak further, he definitely has a chance of challenging Medvedev. If Hercax does not, then obviously it's Medvedev is the absolute clear favourite. So it's really going to depend on Hercax bringing that next level, which is a very good sign then for a semi-final encounter, because we're looking at that type of trajectory. If he can't, it's a no. Medvedev, he's playing clean, he's playing solid. If he can maintain that, that's good. If he can amp it up a little bit more like he did in that final set against Berge, good, he's primed for that semi-final berth. All right, this brings us, I think, to potentially the most exciting match. Even though I said I'm really looking forward to Hercax and Medvedev, I am just as much looking forward to the quarterfinal against Zverev and Alcaraz. But let's look how they got there. Zverev and Norrie, 5 sets. Absolutely brutal. Those are 10-point tiebreakers in the 5th set. But you can see why they've done it, because this match, and there have been many others throughout the Australian Open that probably would have gone very deep to, say, a 14-16 scoreline, even further. It's incredibly impressive, I think, the level of play that some players have been able to withstand, but then not progress because of these 10-point tiebreakers. Again, they're very brutal, but all credit to Norrie. This is the best I've seen Norrie play, I think, if not ever, in the most recent, I'll say 2 seasons, because Zverev, he's stuck in there, he hung in there, he did play like the number 6 player in the world, so all credit to him again. And I've said it on a number of occasions, he became a barrier break again last season, number 6 in the world again. I think he has been slightly higher, but we all know he was off tour for around I want to say 12 to 18 months from memory. Again, it's not in front of me, so it's just an approximation there. But he definitely is privy to those 8 keys, because he's been able to bring it back. Very big similarities there against Svitolina. bringing it back. Even Azarenka, even though she's hovering out and wasn't able to, I think, push through to the quarters, there's a high possibility there. Let's see how the rest of her season ends up. But when we're looking at Zverev, Norrie definitely is privy to, I want to say, almost all 7 keys. He just has not got them as tight knit as we want to see. And that's why when you're the 19th seed going up against the 6th seed, and if you do not have the 7 keys firmly integrated in your game, this is what happens. This is the huge differential between if they're solidified and integrated or if there's a slight glitch. We want that consistency. We want them entrenched in your game, because that's what Djokovic does. That's what Sinner has been working towards. If you can do that, you're in with a fighting chance for that maiden Grand Slam to achieving replicated success. So Norrie, 5 sets, he has that capacity. He's going to ascend closer towards the top 10. And I tell you what, I'm looking forward to Wimbledon and Norrie, because if he keeps this level of play up, he's potentially going to become a barrier breaker this season. So he is one of, I think, 2-3 players this season with that potential. But it's all about that maintenance and upkeep. So if this level is his baseline, or if it was his peak, if it's his peak, there's probably a regression is probably going to follow. If this is his new baseline, like I'm going to say it is Zverev's, this is very good for the rest of the season. I'm going to say Hurkacz, Medvedev, same baseline. Sinner, Djokovic, same baseline. And Alcaraz, same baseline. That's what we're looking for here. So we're looking for those progressions beyond that. And this is what happened with Kekmanovic. I really hope I pronounced that correctly, in Alcaraz. He was pushed in those initial sets, but I'm going to say that lightly, because Alcaraz looked like he was just hanging in there. He was not fazed about the going 4-4. And then Kekmanovic, he fell. And it was because Alcaraz was playing at such a high level, he was able to progress very solidly. And I think that's what we're looking for. He really brought his A game. But I think we got to remember, against Kekmanovic, he was coming off that 5-set win where he was 6-0 against Paul in the 5th. And then for Alcaraz to do that to him, that's what we're talking about, next level. So one player we know can beat another 6-0, and then they can also be beaten, unfortunately, 6-0, because that's when we differentiate different levels of play, different metrics, the different rates of patterns of play, the rates of application, etc. The difference between angles of influence and that levels when we're looking at percentage degrees there, and a huge differential between players outside the top 30, inside the top 20, inside the top 10, to those who have achieved replicated success or at that maiden slam. It's that baseline, that level of maintenance, and if it's able to be upheld. So Zverev, Alcaraz. Now let's remember, Zverev reached the finals of the US Open against Thiem a couple of years ago, and then he had his huge year, I think, after that, where his injury was against Nadal at the French, where he had the prospects of going even further. He was playing some of his best tennis ever. Now he's come back, he's playing very solid. He's dangerous. This season, Zverev he's beginning to peak again. And I think at the end of last year, he started to do the same. And this is very exciting, I think, in this respect, which shows against Alcaraz, let's see what his level is like. If Zverev can maintain his level and further peak, he definitely has a chance of defeating Alcaraz. Alcaraz, however, has he been challenged yet this Australian Open? Absolutely not. Not like this. But Alcaraz has been playing so clean, so solid. Our metrics absolutely adore him. It's just beautiful in all sense of the words, with a very similar patterns of play to the likes of even Federer and Nadal. So there's a very big bias in there. but we haven't seen someone compromise his game in this respect. But when we're looking at metrics, he's definitely at the same level as a Djokovic to Sinner, and that's what we really need to talk about. Somewhat Medvedev has a very different game thrown in there, but there's a reason why Alcaraz is number 2 and why he's been number 1 when we're looking at the similarities in the metrics, and why I've thrown in the likes of a Nadal to Federer, because again, the similarities against the metrics. And I've touched on previously why Nadal and Federer were so successful because of those metrics, and now Djokovic is carrying on that trend, because we know one's retired, one's sidelined, but Djokovic is healthy, he keeps going, and those metrics keep, I think, doing their job in a manner of speaking, because they really compound his game and allow him to continue claiming those Grand Slams. But Alcaraz is the only player with very similar metrics as those three, and that's what we're talking about. Sinner is almost there, almost, not quite, almost, and that's why it's 4 and 2, but he is still progressing opposed to that baseline, and that's the scary thing, that Sinner is projected to get even better. And we need to remember that both of these were projected a number of seasons ago to progress inside the top 10 and to achieve this level of success. And again, that's how powerful our metrics are, our data is to track this. So Djokovic against Sinner is going to be a blockbuster. We all know this, but today is going to show us against Zverev and Alcaraz who's on top, how Alcaraz's metrics fare, and Zverev, what level he's at, if this is his peak or if it's his baseline. It's definitely Alcaraz's baseline, and we're looking for that peak, which I'm sure we are going to see, but there is that potential there. Medvedev, Hurkacz, very interesting, whether or not we're looking at those baselines to peaks. Medvedev's definitely, I'm going to say, at his baseline. If he's going to peak again, he's going to need to slightly peak again against Hurkacz. However, if Hurkacz is going to peak again, it's going to get interesting. And I think that really wraps up where we're at. Round of 16 we've touched on, quarterfinals we've touched on, all across days 8, 9 and 10 of the Australian Open, and we are into the nitty gritty. We've got the end of the quarterfinals happening today, and then the semi-finals are going to be underway. So I think next time you hear from me, it's going to be wrapping up the Australian Open with the end of the quarters, semis and finals. And I think if you've been listening for some time now, you know our predictive analytics, so I'm not going to share in advance who's, I think, projected to claim their either maiden championship title or achieve another Grand Slam, and I'll add that to their names. But obviously the defending champions are highly favoured, but there are definitely those dark horses, irrespective of them being seeded or not. But it's going to be very interesting, so I will hold back. I will promise to deliver those metrics though in our next episode, and why and what has underscored that, especially for those on the hunt to secure that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for joining us today. Oh my goodness, I had a lot of fun with this, and I hope you've been having a lot of fun too, just following along, recapping, I think, the most recent days of the Australian Open, rounding up, I think, the round of 16 and the initial starts of the quarterfinals on the men's and women's tour. It's really rewarding. Those insights, I think, are incredibly powerful. So I hope they're going to help you, I think, review closer. But if you are one of those players, to better, I think, knuckle down with your game and integrate those key metrics. Again, if you are one of those players, track back to our blogs at this time that are being released, and really, I think, review if those 7 keys have been firmly integrated in your game, and then look for the 8th key. Look, to grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Coaching Success, head on over to AIMA International. That's the book that has built up to, I think, the 65 episodes before these special editions were released for the Australian Open. And with I don't think it could have fallen any more sweetly with our 70th episode, in line with the quality of the matches, with the round of 16 to quarters. It's incredibly rewarding. So look, to grab your copy of my new release, How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking, you can find it on AIMA International or Amazon, so irrespective where you're based in the world. For any comments or questions, head to AMA or Topic Thread, the social platform set on data privacy. To interact with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, head on over to Twitter, Threads or Instagram. To catch up on our weekly coaching tips, head on over to TikTok. And to catch up on our blogs, head on over to AIMA International and look for our blog tab, or head on over to Medium. And as always, I'll leave all of the links in the episode notes. For something a little bit different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. To view this week's question and poll, be sure to visit Spotify. Or for something left of field, visit Spruik for some random polls. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and all of the above would be absolutely phenomenal. For those of you who are interested, we do have scholarships available on AIMA International, as well as options to work with me exclusively to optimize your performance and nudge you closer towards that top 10 tennis ranking. Now, normally I put a shout out to players on the cusp of or wanting to claim their maiden Grand Slam, but there have been such a large number or high quality of players this Australian Open, irrespective of your ranking range, if it's 150 in the world, 80 in the world, 40 in the world, it does not matter. Let's nudge you closer. Let's get you inside the top 20 to begin, and we will track you closer and closer towards that top 10 tennis ranking. So don't be shy and come and say hi. On that note, thank you so much for listening. I'm so incredibly grateful. I'm your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.